Civilization did not begin with freedom. It began with fear. Fear of hunger, fear of darkness, fear of the other standing beyond the fire at night. And from that fear, culture was born not as art, not as beauty, but as instruction. Do this or die, follow this or disappear, belong or be erased, long before laws, before nations, before flags. Civilization was a quiet agreement: we survive only if we obey. And from that moment, humanity started trading instinct for structure. Every era that followed did not break this contract, it only refined it. We like to imagine history as progress, as a straight line, moving upward from caves to cities, from tribes to technology. But what if that line is not pointing toward freedom? What if it is pointing toward efficiency? What if civilization did not liberate the human being, but trained it, shaped it, disciplined it, taught it when to speak, when to stay silent, what to desire, what to fear, and most importantly, what to accept as normal? The ancient world demanded obedience through survival. The fields had to be worked. The gods had to be pleased. The rules had to be followed, or the group would collapse. There was no illusion, there was no comfort in rebellion, only consequence. Later empires arrived and wrapped obedience in law. They told people, this is not force, this is order, this is not control, this is civilization. And people believed it because order feels safer than chaos. Even when it cages you, the medieval world replaced law with faith. Truth was no longer discovered, it was inherited, and questioning was not curiosity. It was danger. Then came the awakening, the Renaissance, the age we love to celebrate as the rebirth of the human mind. But even then, the thinking human was allowed only as long as thought did not threaten structure. The body was freed in art, but the mind was still watched. The industrial age went further. It did not ask you what you believe, it asked what you produce. Time became measured, life became scheduled. The human being was no longer a soul in search of meaning, but a unit in motion valued by output, not by depth. And now today, we live in the most advanced civilization in history, surrounded by choice, surrounded by comfort, surrounded by endless information, and yet more aligned, more predictable, more guided than any generation before us. No guards, no chains, no decrees, just habits. Algorithms, expectations, culture no longer tells you what to do. It tells you who you are, and you repeat it willingly. Because belonging is easier than standing alone. Because comfort feels like safety, and safety feels like freedom. Civilization has changed its language, but not its intention. It no longer commands, it convinces it, no longer punishes it, rewards. And the most powerful moment in this entire history is not when people were clearly oppressed, but when they stopped noticing the pressure at all. This is not a story about technology or empires. This is a story about adaptation, about how humans slowly learned to fit into systems that did not love them, how obedience became responsibility, how silence became maturity, how survival instincts were repackaged as culture and sold back to us as progress. And the question that has followed us from the first fire to the glowing screens in our hands is still unanswered. Did civilization make us better or just quieter? As culture changed, humans did not become free. They became better at adapting, and this adaptation did not arrive suddenly. It crept in quietly, generation after generation, until it stopped being noticed. Freedom was never violently removed. Instead, it was gently redefined, reshaped into something safer, something manageable, something that would not disturb the order of things. In early human societies, adaptation was survival. You followed the rhythm of nature, the rules of the tribe, the customs of the group, because disobedience meant isolation, and isolation meant death. There was no illusion of choice and no romantic idea of freedom. There was only belonging or extinction, and adaptation made sense. It kept you alive, but as societies grew larger and more complex, Adaptation stopped being only about survival and started becoming about stability. Rules multiplied, rituals formed not to question the world, but to explain it, to fix it into predictable shapes. Culture emerged as a system of repetition. Do this, believe this, honor this, fear that, and over time, repetition hardened into normality. What was once chosen became expected. What was once questioned became tradition, and what was once feared became sacred. Empires later refined this process. They understood that controlling behavior was easier than controlling bodies. Laws replaced raw force. Obedience was framed as order, and order was framed as civilization. People were told that freedom existed inside the system, not outside it, and most accepted this because chaos is terrifying and structure feels protective even when it restricts you. The medieval world deepened adaptation further by merging culture with faith. Truth was no longer something you searched for. It was something you inherited. Obedience was no longer just practical. It was moral. Questioning was no longer curiosity. It was sin, and adaptation became virtue. The good person was the obedient person, the faithful person, the quiet person. Then came the age of reason, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment moments. We celebrate as humanity waking up. But even these awakenings had boundaries. Thinking was encouraged only until it threatened power. Creativity was praised only while it remained harmless, and adaptation adjusted again. The individual was allowed to think, but not to disrupt. The industrial age transformed adaptation into routine. Time was measured. Lives were scheduled. Efficiency replaced meaning. Humans adapted to machines. Not the other way around, waking at the same hours, moving at the same pace, living by the same clock. Freedom was redefined once more, not as control over life, but as access to comfort. You were free if you could survive within the system, and adaptation was praised as responsibility. Then modern civilization arrived, quieter, smoother, more persuasive than anything before. It no longer needed to command or punish it, only needed to guide desires. Culture stopped telling people what to do and started telling them who they were. Identity replaced belief. Preference replaced value, and adaptation became internal. People no longer needed to be forced to comply. They learned to do it themselves, through habits, through expectations, through fear of exclusion. Freedom became the ability to choose between options that were already prepared. Individuality became a style, not a stance, and rebellion became a product sold back to those who felt trapped. And the most profound shift happened here. People stopped asking whether they were free and started asking whether they were comfortable, because comfort feels like safety, and safety feels like freedom even when it is not. Adaptation reached its final form when it stopped feeling like surrender and started feeling like common sense. People learned to call silence maturity, obedience, realism, and compromise. Wisdom culture succeeded not by breaking the human spirit, but by teaching it to bend until bending felt natural. And now we stand in a world more advanced than any before it, with endless information, endless choices, endless voices, and yet we move in predictable patterns, think within acceptable limits, and fear standing alone, more than being wrong. Culture did not make us free. It made us functional. It taught us how to fit, how to cope, how to endure. And the question that remains is not whether civilization changed us. It clearly did. The question is whether we still remember what freedom was supposed to feel like before adaptation became our greatest skill. From ritual to routine, how culture changed us is not a story of sudden transformation, but of slow erosion. Rituals were once conscious acts performed with awareness, intention, and meaning. Early humans did not repeat actions mindlessly. They repeated them because those actions connected them to survival, to nature, to the group, to forces they did not understand. Rituals marked danger, gratitude, fear, and hope. They were moments where people stopped and acknowledged life itself. But over time, as societies stabilized, those rituals lost their urgency. What once demanded attention became repetition, and repetition without reflection slowly turned ritual into habit. Habits no longer asked why, they only demanded continuation, and culture learned something powerful: when repetition is constant, it no longer needs belief, it only needs time. Civilizations grew, and with them, the need for predictability. Rituals were simplified, standardized, and eventually absorbed into daily life. Behavior became expected rather than chosen, and culture stopped asking individuals to understand it, only asked them to participate. This was the turning point when culture stopped being something people performed and became something people lived inside. Ancient rituals once reminded humans of their fragility. Later routines reminded them of their place. As long as you followed the pattern, you were safe, accepted. Invisible deviation became the real danger. Empires mastered this transformation. They took sacred acts and turned them into civic duties, loyalty oaths, daily customs, social hierarchies, all inherited, all unquestioned. Ritual meaning was replaced by routine compliance. People no longer needed to believe deeply, they only needed to behave correctly, and culture became less about shared understanding and more about shared behavior. The medieval world intensified this shift. Rituals were everywhere: prayers, gestures, holidays, confessions, but their repetition was no longer personal. It was mandatory routine. Obedience was dressed as virtue, and habit was confused with faith. People learned to move through life, performing actions whose meanings they no longer examined, and this performance created stability, but it also created silence. When the Renaissance arrived, it appeared to challenge this structure. It celebrated the individual, the mind, the body, art, and reason. But even this rebellion quickly became routine. Thinking was allowed, but only within safe boundaries. Creativity flourished, but only where it did not disrupt order. Rituals changed shape, but routines remained. People adapted again, learning when to speak and when to restrain themselves. The industrial age accelerated everything. Rituals disappeared almost entirely, replaced by schedules, clocks, shifts, alarms, workdays, and weekends. Life itself became routine, measured, divided, optimized. Repetition reached its peak. Humans woke, slept, worked, and rested according to systems that did not ask for belief. Only compliance. Culture no longer needed symbols. It had timetables, and adaptation meant efficiency. The modern world perfected the final stage. Rituals are now rare, but routines are everywhere. Scrolling habits, consumption cycles, behavioral patterns reinforced by design. Culture no longer teaches values, it teaches behavior, subtly shaping attention, desire, and identity. People repeat actions thousands of times without noticing them. Liking, sharing, buying, responding, reacting. Culture does not command it. Nudges, and the most powerful routine is the one you believe you chose. Rituals once slowed people down. They forced reflection. They reminded humans that actions had meaning. Routines do the opposite. They speed life up. They remove pauses. They normalize repetition without awareness. And this is how culture changed us. Not by violence, not by force, but by convenience. By replacing conscious acts with automatic ones, until people stopped noticing the difference between living and performing, between choosing and repeating. And somewhere along the way, culture stopped being something we did and became something that did us. The question is not whether routines are necessary. The question is what we lost when rituals faded, and whether a civilization built entirely on habit can ever remember how to act with intention again. Ancient civilization was not built on ideas of freedom, identity, or self-expression. It was built on survival. Culture in the ancient world was not a choice, it was a necessity. Every rule, every custom, every tradition existed for one reason: to keep the group alive. Culture was a survival manual, written not in books, but in behavior. how to hunt, when to move, who to trust, what to fear and what never to question. The individual did not exist as a separate unit. A person was meaningful only as long as they served. The continuity of the group identity was collective, not personal. And to break from that collective was not rebellion, it was suicide. Rituals in the ancient world were not symbolic performances, they were practical tools, repeated actions, believed to keep nature predictable and danger at bay. When people gathered around fire, performed ceremonies, or obeyed elders, they were not expressing belief, they were reducing uncertainty. Survival depended on repetition because repetition created stability, and stability meant safety. Obedience was not moral, it was instinctive. The one who adapted survived. The one who questioned endangered everyone and was quickly removed. Not because the group was cruel, but because fear was absolute nature. Punished mistakes immediately. Hunger, drought, predators, and disease did not allow philosophical hesitation, so culture became strict, unforgiving, and deeply conservative. Change was dangerous. Tradition was protection in this world. Freedom had no meaning because choice itself was a threat. Choosing differently risked breaking patterns that kept the group alive. Ancient humans did not ask, "Who am I?" They asked, "Where do I belong?" And belonging came with rules that were followed without reflection. Elders, gods, ancestors, and myths all served the same function. They anchored behavior and discouraged deviation. The sacred was not separate from daily life. It was embedded in it. Every action carried consequence, not just for the individual, but for the entire group. And this collective pressure shaped the human mind. Adaptation became the highest virtue. Silence became wisdom, conformity became intelligence, and those who fit survived long enough to pass these traits on. This is where the foundation was laid. Culture equaled survival, obedience equaled life, and deviation equaled death. And although centuries would pass and civilizations would rise and fall, this ancient equation never fully disappeared. It only changed its language. The fears softened, the rituals transformed, but the core lesson remained deeply embedded in human psychology. Survive first, question later. And this instinct would follow humanity into every future civilization long after the original dangers were gone. Freedom is often spoken of as if it has always existed as a natural human state, something buried inside us waiting to be reclaimed. But when we look closely at the ancient world, the question becomes unavoidable: did freedom ever truly exist? Or is it a concept we invented much later to describe what we felt we were missing early? Humans did not experience life as a series of open choices. Their days were governed by necessity, by hunger, by weather, by danger, and by the fragile dependence on the group. Survival left no room for abstract liberty. Every decision was constrained by immediate consequences, and what we now call freedom would have been understood as recklessness. The individual could not act independently because independence threatened the collective, and the collective was the only shield against extinction. Belonging was not optional, it was existence itself, and so obedience was not imposed. It was internalized long before laws or rulers appeared. Culture did not ask people to be free, it asked them to remain alive, and in such a world, the idea of freedom had no practical function. There was nothing to be free from because there was no alternative structure to step into. Choice itself was limited by reality, and reality was unforgiving. As societies slowly stabilized and dangers became less immediate, humans began to notice the weight of rules that once felt natural. When survival stopped being the only concern, constraint became visible, and only then could the idea of freedom emerge, not as a lived condition, but as a comparison, a contrast between what was and what could be. Freedom was born the moment people sensed that life might be more than endurance. It was not a discovery, but a reaction, a word created to name the absence. People began to feel freedom, therefore, may not be an ancient truth. lost over time, but a modern longing projected backward. We imagine free ancestors roaming without limits because it comforts us. But history suggests the opposite. Constraint came first. Structure came first, adaptation came first, and freedom arrived late, as an idea, not as a reality, and even then it remained fragile. Conditional and rare freedom existed briefly in moments, not in systems, in pauses between necessity and control, in fleeting acts of defiance, creativity, or thought, but never as a stable state. The tragedy is that once freedom was named, it became something that could be promised, managed, and eventually simulated. Civilizations learned to speak the language of freedom without allowing its substance, and today we live surrounded by its symbols while still negotiating its boundaries. Perhaps the most honest answer to the question is that freedom was never fully real and never fully invented. It is a tension, a desire that appears whenever humans sense that their lives are being shaped more than chosen. And the fact that we keep asking this question across centuries may be the clearest sign that freedom has always been incomplete. Not a memory we lost, but an ideal we keep reaching for and failing to hold. In the ancient classical world, culture took a decisive turn. Survival was no longer managed only by instinct, tradition, or ritual. It was organized through law, and this transformation changed the relationship between the human being and power. Forever, law was presented not as domination but as civilization. Not as force, but as fairness. Rules were written, codified, displayed in public spaces, and taught as the foundation of order for the first time. Obedience no longer came only from fear of nature or the gods, but from trust in systems. People were told that laws existed to protect them, to create stability, to ensure justice, and this belief made control far more effective because it felt legitimate. The Greek polis and the Roman Republic framed law as a shared agreement, a rational structure that elevated humans above chaos. But beneath this promise lay a quiet shift. Culture was no longer something inherited unconsciously. It became something enforced consciously. Behavior was no longer guided by collective instinct, but by abstract rules that applied equally in theory but unevenly in practice. Citizens learned that freedom existed within boundaries drawn by law. You were free as long as you remained inside the framework, and those boundaries quickly became invisible because they were normalized. Law did not feel like restriction, it felt like order, and order feels safe, especially when contrasted with disorder. Punishment was no longer immediate or personal. It was procedural, distant, institutional. This distance softened resistance. People did not feel oppressed, they felt governed, and governance was celebrated as progress over barbarism. But this progress carried a cost. Moral responsibility began to shift from the individual to the system. People no longer asked, "Is this right?" They asked, "Is this legal?" And culture slowly absorbed this logic. Justice was no longer an internal compass. It became an external reference. The law decided what was acceptable, what was punishable, and what was ignored. And once behavior aligned with legality, conscience became secondary. Adaptation changed again. It was no longer about survival or faith, but about compliance. Knowing the rules, navigating them, using them when possible, avoiding them when necessary. Law rewarded those who mastered its language, not those who questioned its purpose, and culture praised this mastery as intelligence, wisdom. Citizenship rebellion was no longer framed as danger to survival, but as danger to order. And order became sacred even when it preserved inequality. Slavery could exist within a legal system and still be called civilization. Conquest could be justified through law and still be called peace because legality masked violence with procedure. The most powerful outcome of this era was psychological. People learned to internalize law. They began to regulate themselves even when no authority was present. because culture taught them that law was morality and morality was stability. This is when obedience became respectable, when submission wore the mask of responsibility, and when culture stopped asking people to survive and started asking them to behave. And although later eras would change the language of control, the legal mind shaped here would remain a foundation, teaching generations that freedom was not the absence of constraint, but the privilege of operating correctly within it. As laws multiplied, something subtle happened to the human conscience. Responsibility slowly moved outward. When rules are few, people must rely on judgment. When rules are many, judgment feels unnecessary. The law begins to think for you, decide for you, excuse you in the ancient world. This shift was profound because law promised fairness and order, but in doing so, it also offered relief. Relief from moral burden. People no longer had to ask what is right. They only had to ask what is permitted. And this distinction matters because legality and morality are not the same. The law is designed to manage society, not to perfect the soul. As legal systems grew more complex, they covered more behavior, more situations, more possibilities. And with each addition, the space for personal conscience narrowed. Not because people became evil, but because they became comfortable. When an action is legal, it feels justified even when it harms. When an action is illegal, it feels wrong even when it is compassionate. The law creates moral shortcuts. It teaches people to outsource ethical thinking to structure. And once this outsourcing becomes habitual, conscience weakens not dramatically but quietly. People stop feeling responsible for outcomes and start feeling responsible only for compliance. History shows this clearly. Atrocities can be committed within legal frameworks. Discrimination can be normalized by statutes. Violence can be bureaucratized and still feel clean because it follows procedure. The danger is not that law exists. Society needs it. The danger is when law replaces inner judgment instead of supporting it. When people say, "I followed the law," instead of "I did what was right." This is not the collapse of conscience, but its sedation. Conscience does not disappear, it becomes dormant, waiting for moments when law fails and reality forces the individual to choose again. The uncomfortable truth is that strong legal systems require strong consciences to remain humane, but cultures often build the former while neglecting the latter. And when law grows faster than moral reflection, people become orderly, but not necessarily just obedient, but not necessarily good. And this may be the paradox at the heart of civilization. The more rules we create to control behavior, the less we practice the inner discipline required to choose wisely without them. In the medieval world, culture shifted again, but this time, control did not come primarily through survival or law. It came through belief. Faith moved from being a personal response to uncertainty into a total framework for behavior. Truth was no longer something to be discovered through experience or reason. It was something received, inherited, and protected. Belief systems did not merely explain the world. They organized it. They told people who they were, where they belonged, what they owed, and what they must never question. Culture stopped asking people to obey rules and started asking them to submit meaning in this world. Morality was no longer negotiated internally. It was defined externally by sacred authority. And this changed the human psyche profoundly. When belief governs behavior, conscience no longer needs to struggle. Doubt becomes dangerous, curiosity becomes suspicion, and obedience becomes virtue. The good person is not the questioning one, but the faithful one. Faith offered comfort in a harsh world. It promised order in chaos and salvation beyond suffering. But it also removed the burden of choice. When truth is absolute, there is no need for moral wrestling. Actions are judged not by their consequences, but by their alignment with doctrine and culture. Reinforce this alignment through ritual repetition, Prayer, confession gestures, holidays, all performed daily, weekly, yearly, until belief became muscle memory. People learned how to act holy even when they no longer reflected on why power understood this deeply. Religious authority and political authority merged, reinforcing each other. Kings ruled by divine right laws carried sacred weight, and resistance was framed not only as treason but as heresy. This made control nearly invisible because it felt righteous punishment was no longer cruelty. It was correction. Souls were being saved, order was being preserved, and violence could be justified as love for truth. In such a system, adaptation reached a new level. Humans adapted not only their behavior but their inner voice. They learned to silence doubt before it surfaced, to fear their own thoughts, and to measure themselves constantly against an ideal they could never fully reach. Guilt became a tool stronger than force, because it followed the individual everywhere. Culture no longer needed surveillance. People watched themselves. Faith replaced law, not by eliminating rules, but by internalizing them deeply. Obedience no longer required enforcement. It was performed willingly in the name of goodness, and this era left a lasting imprint. Even after its structures faded, the habit of surrendering judgment to authority, the fear of questioning shared truths, the comfort found in ready-made answers, all survived long beyond the medieval period. Belief had proven that the most effective way to shape behavior was not to control the body but to define the meaning of right and wrong itself. And once culture achieved that level of influence, freedom did not vanish. It simply became sinful to desire. When humans handed thinking over to God, the first thing they felt was relief. Not because life became easier, but because uncertainty became bearable. The medieval world was shaped by constant insecurity. Disease, famine, war, and sudden death surrounded everyday life, and the human mind searched desperately for stability. Faith offered a framework that did not ask people to understand the world, only to trust it, and this trust removed a heavy burden. The burden of endless questioning, of moral doubt, of trying to make sense of suffering alone when answers were believed to come from a divine source. The individual no longer carried full responsibility for meaning. Truth and judgment existence stopped feeling random and began to feel guided. And in that sense, surrendering thought did bring comfort. But this comfort was not neutral. It reshaped the inner life profoundly. Once truth was considered absolute, thinking itself became dangerous. Curiosity was no longer a virtue, but a temptation. Doubt was not a step toward understanding, but a sign of weakness or corruption. And so the mind learned to rest by avoiding conflict rather than resolving it. People were taught that peace came from acceptance, not exploration. And over time, this lesson became internalized. Faith did not only organize beliefs, it organized emotions, fear, guilt, hope, and desire. All became regulated by doctrine. The conscience was no longer a personal dialogue, but a reflection of sacred rules. And this removed the exhausting struggle of moral ambiguity, but it also reduced the capacity for independent judgment when actions are guided by divine command. Responsibility shifts upward. Individuals act not because they have decided, but because they have submitted. And this submission feels lighter because failure is no longer entirely personal. Sin can be confessed, doubt can be forgiven, obedience can be rewarded. The system absorbs anxiety and returns reassurance, but at the same time, it conditions the mind to associate safety with agreement and danger with thought. The human spirit adapts by learning when not to think, by silencing questions before they fully form. This creates a quiet psychological dependence, because once thinking is outsourced, the individual becomes less confident in their own judgment and more reliant on authority to define right and wrong. This reliance feels like humility, but it gradually weakens inner moral muscles that only grow through use. The relief of faith therefore resembles rest. More than healing, it quiets the pain without addressing its source. And while this rest can be necessary in times of extreme hardship, it becomes limiting when prolonged entire generations grew accustomed to living inside answers rather than seeking them. And when later eras attempted to awaken critical thought, they encountered resistance not because people were incapable of thinking, but because thinking had long been associated with danger, anxiety, and punishment. The comfort of surrender had become familiar, and familiarity feels safer than freedom. The medieval exchange of thought for faith provided emotional stability, but delayed intellectual responsibility. It protected the mind from chaos, but also from growth. And this legacy continues to echo whenever people prefer certainty over understanding, obedience over inquiry, and comfort over the difficult work of forming their own convictions. Because once a culture learns that peace can be purchased by surrendering thought, it becomes very hard to convince it that freedom is worth the discomfort of thinking again. During the Renaissance, the center of gravity shifted again after centuries of faith dominating behavior and meaning. The human being slowly returned to the foreground, art, science, philosophy, and curiosity re-emerged with a force that made it seem as if humanity was waking from a long sleep. The individual mind was celebrated. The human body was studied, admired, painted not as sinful but as beautiful, proportioned, worthy of attention. People began to look at the world not only through scripture but through observation, reason, and experience. And this moment is often described as liberation, the rebirth of freedom, the triumph of human potential. But beneath this awakening lay a more complex reality. The Renaissance did not dismantle the structures of control. It renegotiated them. Humans were placed at the center, but only as long as that centrality did not threaten power. Thinking was encouraged, but selectively creativity was praised. But carefully contained art could explore the human form. But political authority remained largely unquestioned. Science could advance, but only until it collided with doctrine. Philosophy could ask questions, but only within tolerable limits. The mind was invited to expand, yet reminded constantly where its boundaries lay. This created a new psychological tension. Humans were told they mattered, but also shown that their importance was conditional. The individual gained visibility, but not sovereignty. Freedom was tasted, but not secured, and adaptation adjusted. Once again, people learned to think brilliantly while navigating danger. They learned to disguise radical ideas in allegory, symbolism, and art. They learned to push boundaries quietly rather than confront them openly, and this subtle negotiation became a new cultural skill. The Renaissance human was not the medieval believer, nor the ancient survivor, but a careful thinker, aware of possibility and punishment. At the same time, conscience began to reawaken, but it did so cautiously. Individuals felt responsible for their thoughts, yet feared their consequences, and so self-censorship replaced blind obedience. The mind became active but guarded. This era revealed that placing the human at the center did not automatically result in freedom. It resulted in tension between potential and permission. The Renaissance showed what humanity could be, but not what it was allowed to become. And while it reignited curiosity and dignity, it also taught a lasting lesson that thinking must often learn to survive within power rather than overthrow it. The human returned to the center, but the walls around that center remained, and adaptation once more ensured that progress continued without rupture, leaving freedom present as an aspiration rather than a condition, and setting the stage for future eras to push further while carrying the same unresolved struggle between expression and control. A thinking human was still not a free human because thought alone does not guarantee autonomy. It only reveals the boundaries within which autonomy is allowed. During the Renaissance, people learned to question, observe, and imagine, but they also learned that ideas carry consequences. The mind could travel far while the body remained constrained. Thinkers discovered new truths, yet had to measure every word, every symbol, every conclusion against power, religion, and tradition. Thinking expanded, but expression was filtered. This created a paradox. A person could see the world differently, yet live within the same structures unchanged. Awareness grew faster than freedom, and this gap produced tension rather than liberation. Many thinkers lived double lives, outwardly compliant, inwardly radical, adapting, not by surrendering thought, but by hiding it. Culture rewarded intelligence that knew when to stop speaking, and punished honesty that moved too quickly. Thinking therefore became a private act, while obedience remained public. The individual gained an inner world, but did not gain control over the outer one. Freedom requires not only the ability to think, but the ability to act on thought without fear, and that condition was rare. The Renaissance proved that consciousness can awaken long before society allows it to move, and this delay taught generations a quiet lesson. Thinking is powerful, but survival still demands caution. So the thinking human learned restraint, learned compromise, learned to navigate limits rather than break them, and in doing so, adapted once again, becoming more aware, but not yet free aware, of possibility, but trained to live without it. During the industrial age, the transformation of the human being reached a new stage, one that did not rely on belief or law alone, but on efficiency. Culture no longer asked who you were or what you believed. It asked what you could do and how consistently you could do it. Time was broken into units, days into shifts, life into schedules, and the human body was reorganized to match the rhythm of machines. Work no longer followed the natural cycles of light seasons, or need it followed the clock and the factory whistle. And this mechanical order reshaped the human mind as deeply as it reshaped cities. People adapted by learning to suppress instinct, fatigue, emotion, and reflection. In favor of productivity, repetition became the dominant experience. Not ritual repetition filled with meaning, but mechanical repetition emptied of it. The value of a person was measured by output, reliability, and speed. Identity slowly detached from inner life and attached itself to function. What you did became who you were, and culture reinforced this relentlessly. Discipline, punctuality, obedience, and endurance were praised as virtues, while slowness, deviation, and idleness were framed as moral failures. Freedom was redefined again, not as control over one's life, but as the ability to survive within the system. Through wages, comfort, and predictability, people were told they were free because they could work, choose employment, consume goods. But this freedom was conditional and narrow. The structure of life itself was no longer negotiable. The industrial system did not need belief or loyalty. It needed consistency, and humans adapted perfectly. Learning to become interchangeable, replaceable, efficient inner depth was unnecessary. Silence was productive, and questioning slowed the machine. So it was discouraged. Adaptation reached a point where people began to see themselves as parts of a larger mechanism, responsible not for meaning but for performance. Conscience weakened further because responsibility was fragmented. No one felt fully accountable for outcomes, only for tasks. Assigned suffering became abstract, distant, spread across systems, and justified by necessity. The greatest achievement of the industrial age was not technological, it was psychological. Humans learned to live as functions. Without constantly feeling the loss, they learned to find pride in productivity, identity in occupation, worth in endurance, and this training left a lasting imprint. Even beyond factories, modern life still rewards efficiency over reflection, speed over depth, and compliance over autonomy. The industrial age taught culture that control does not require force or faith. It only requires structure, and humans trained within structure will adapt until function feels natural and meaning becomes optional. Did humans sacrifice their own rhythm for comfort? Is not a simple question, because the sacrifice did not feel like a loss. At first, it felt like relief for most of human history. Life followed natural rhythms, the rise and fall of the sun, the change of seasons. The limits of the body rest came when the body demanded it work, stopped when exhaustion arrived. But these rhythms were unpredictable, harsh, and often cruel. The industrial age offered an alternative, a controlled rhythm, one that promised stability, wages, shelter, warmth, routine, and safety. And many accepted this trade willingly because natural rhythm had never been kind. Comfort arrived wrapped in structure, clocks, schedules, shifts, calendars, alarms, all designed to remove uncertainty, and uncertainty is exhausting at first. This felt like progress. Life became more predictable. Hunger, less constant; survival, less fragile. But in accepting this order, humans began to move against their own biological and psychological tempo, waking when machines required, not when bodies were ready, working at speeds set by systems, not by capacity, resting according to permission, not need. And over time, the body adapted, but adaptation is not the same as harmony. It is endurance. The human organism learned to function under imposed rhythm, but it paid for this with fatigue, anxiety, disconnection, and a quiet sense of inner acceleration. Comfort masked these costs because comfort numbs discomfort and routine normalizes strain. People stopped asking whether the rhythm suited them and started asking how to survive within it. Culture praised those who could endure longer, faster, more consistently, and framed this endurance as discipline, maturity, and success. Slowly, the natural signals of the body, hunger, rest, curiosity, boredom, were overridden by external demands and internalized expectations. People learned to ignore themselves because listening slowed productivity and threatened stability. The tragedy is not that humans lost their rhythm entirely, but that they forgot it ever belonged to them. When comfort depends on compliance, rhythm becomes a liability, pauses become inefficiency, slowness becomes failure, and rest becomes guilt. Modern life continues this pattern. Even outside, factories, screens accelerate attention. Notifications fragment focus. Constant stimulation replaces silence. The rhythm is no longer mechanical, but digital. Yet the effect is similar. Humans move faster than they can process and call this normal. The sacrifice, therefore, was not dramatic, it was subtle. People traded rhythm for reliability, traded instinct for schedule, traded presence for predictability. And because the exchange reduced immediate suffering, it felt reasonable, but something essential was dulled. The ability to move at one's own pace, to feel time rather than manage it, to exist. Without constant optimization, comfort did not destroy human rhythm. It convinced humans to suppress it. And the longer this suppression continues, the harder it becomes to remember that another way of living ever existed. And perhaps the most revealing sign of this loss is how uncomfortable stillness feels today. How silence creates anxiety, how unstructured time feels wasted, because a civilization that has trained people to abandon their own rhythm will always struggle when nothing is telling them what to do next. In the modern era, culture no longer announces itself. It no longer arrives as law, scripture, ritual, or factory whistle. It operates quietly, invisibly woven into everyday life, so deeply that it is rarely recognized as culture at all. Modern culture does not tell people what to do. It tells them what to want, how to feel, and who to be. And because these messages are subtle, personalized, and constant, they feel natural rather than imposed power. No longer needs symbols or force. It functions through design, convenience, and repetition, shaping behavior without demanding obedience. The rules are not written, they are absorbed. Preferences replace commands, and habits replace rituals. People do not feel controlled because control now feels like choice. This is the most advanced form culture has ever taken, because resistance requires awareness, and awareness requires noticing something that has been normalized. Culture today hides inside interfaces, algorithms, trends, expectations, and social feedback loops. It teaches behavior by rewarding attention, visibility, approval, and belonging. Rather than by punishing deviation, people adapt automatically, adjusting speech, opinions, identities, and even emotions to fit invisible standards. The fear is no longer exile or punishment. It is irrelevance, exclusion, silence. Culture does not say you must conform. It says, if you do not, you will disappear. And disappearance feels worse than obedience because it erases meaning. Modern individuals regulate themselves, constantly curating their thoughts, reactions, and expressions to remain aligned with what is acceptable, desirable, or popular. And this self-regulation is efficient because it feels voluntary. People believe they are expressing themselves while simultaneously narrowing themselves. Identity becomes a performance shaped by external response. Authenticity becomes risky because it cannot be optimized. Culture once demanded belief. Now it demands engagement. Once it required faith. Now it requires attention. The most valuable resource is no longer labor or loyalty, but focus. And culture trains people from childhood to fragment it. Notifications, interruptions, endless stimulation ensure that reflection slows down and silence feels uncomfortable. When thinking requires uninterrupted time, a distracted mind becomes easier to guide. Modern culture does not erase freedom, it overwhelms it with options. Choices are endless, but depth is rare. People can choose what to watch, buy, like, share, or believe, but rarely pause long enough to ask why they choose at all. Adaptation reaches its quiet peak. Here, individuals no longer need to be trained. They train themselves, measuring worth through metrics, validation, through reaction, and success. Through visibility. Culture no longer feels external because it lives inside the self-shaping desire before conscious thought emerges, and this creates the illusion of autonomy. People feel free because no one is forcing them, yet their behavior remains predictable, patterned, and aligned with systems. They do not control. The most unsettling truth of the modern era is that culture succeeded not by dominating the human mind, but by merging with it. When norms feel personal preferences, when expectations feel like identity, and when conformity feels like self-expression, resistance becomes confused and freedom becomes difficult to define because there is no clear enemy to oppose, only a seamless environment that gently guides every step. And the final question of this era is not who controls culture, but whether humans can still recognize it when it no longer looks like control at all. The most powerful culture is the one you do not feel, because it does not confront you. It does not announce itself as authority, and it does not demand obedience through fear or punishment. Instead, it settles into everyday life so smoothly that it becomes indistinguishable from reality itself. This kind of culture does not tell you what to do. It teaches you what feels natural. It shapes your instincts before you have time to question them. And by the time you notice its influence, your behavior has already adapted. Culture like this does not rely on visible rules because it no longer needs them. It works through habits, routines, expectations, and unspoken agreements that guide action without ever appearing as force. When something feels normal, it escapes scrutiny. People rarely question what everyone else accepts. An invisible culture understands this deeply. It hides in language, in humor, in trends, in what is praised and what is ignored. It trains people not by instruction, but by repetition, until repetition becomes preference, and preference becomes identity. When culture operates invisibly, resistance becomes difficult because there is nothing clear to oppose. There are no chains to break, no laws to defy, only a subtle sense that certain thoughts feel out of place, certain behaviors feel risky, and certain questions feel unnecessary. This quiet pressure is far more effective than open control, because it convinces individuals that conformity is self-expression and adaptation is maturity. People begin to regulate themselves long before any external authority intervenes, measuring their worth through approval, adjusting their voice to fit acceptable tones, filtering their thoughts. To avoid friction, culture no longer has to suppress dissent. It simply makes dissent feel awkward, irrelevant, or extreme. And this creates a population that is orderly without being forced, aligned without being commanded, obedient without being aware. The most powerful effect of invisible culture is psychological. It reshapes desire itself. People stop wanting what disrupts the system and start craving what sustains it. Comfort becomes virtue, efficiency becomes morality, and speed becomes intelligence. Slowness, reflection, and silence begin to feel suspicious because they resist optimization culture. Rewards, constant engagement, constant response, constant visibility, leaving little room for pause. And pause is dangerous because it creates space to notice manipulation. This is why invisible culture fills every gap with noise, screens, notifications, updates, endless content. Because silence invites awareness, and awareness threatens control. When culture becomes internal, it no longer needs to persuade it, pre-selects choices, limits imagination, and frames the world in advance. People believe they are choosing freely, but their options have already been shaped. Their attention already guided, their values already reinforced. The illusion of autonomy remains intact, because autonomy feels present when choice exists, even if those choices are narrow, repetitive, and predictable. This is not a culture that breaks the human spirit. It is one that slowly redirects it until alignment feels voluntary and resistance feels exhausting. And perhaps the most unsettling truth is that invisible culture does not remove freedom by force. It dulls the desire for it. When people stop noticing what shapes them, they stop asking whether another way of living is possible, and culture reaches its highest power, not when it dominates openly, but when it disappears completely, leaving behind a world where people live inside systems they no longer recognize as systems and defend them, not because they are just, but because they feel like life itself. You are no longer told what to do. You are told what to want. This is the quiet shift that defines modern culture. Control no longer operates through commands or prohibitions. It works by shaping desire itself. When power tells you what to do, resistance is possible, refusal is visible, disobedience has meaning. But when power tells you what to want, resistance becomes confused because desire feels personal. Natural, chosen people defend what they believe they want, even when that desire was carefully engineered. Culture today rarely says must or cannot. Instead, it whispers should and why not. Through images, trends, stories, algorithms, and social cues, it surrounds you with examples of what success, happiness, beauty, and meaning look like. And over time, these examples sink in, shaping aspiration before reflection occurs. Individuals begin to chase goals they never consciously selected, measuring their worth against standards they did not create, and fearing failure in games they never agreed to play. This is more effective than orders because it recruits the self as an enforcer. People motivate discipline and punish themselves. When they fall short, desire becomes a leash. Pulled from the inside, attention is guided, appetite is trained, and dissatisfaction is manufactured. To keep movement constant, wanting replaces thinking, and consumption replaces reflection. When desire is managed, action follows automatically. And culture no longer needs to say, do this, because wanting ensures compliance. The most unsettling part is how comfortable this feels, because fulfillment is promised just ahead. Satisfaction always delayed, always purchasable, always optimized, and in chasing it, people rarely stop to ask who decided this was worth wanting. At all the danger of being told what to want, is not that you lose choice, but that choice becomes circular. You move freely, but only within a path already drawn. And when desire itself is no longer yours, freedom becomes difficult to define because nothing is being taken away. You are simply being guided, and the final question left behind is whether a life driven by borrowed desires can ever feel truly lived, or whether it will always feel busy, satisfied, and strangely empty at the same time. Truth became whatever was declared sacred, and once truth is sacred, it no longer needs to be examined. It only needs to be protected in such a world. Correctness is not measured by understanding, but by alignment with what is holy, what has been blessed by authority, what has been repeated long enough to feel eternal. When truth is defined this way, questioning is no longer curiosity. It is risk, because a question does not simply seek an answer. It threatens the structure that depends on certainty to survive. Asking why opens the door to doubt, and doubt weakens obedience. So culture reframes inquiry as danger, not because questions are evil, but because they are powerful. They expose the difference between belief and reality, between tradition and truth. People learn quickly that safety lies in agreement, not exploration. Silence becomes wisdom, compliance becomes morality, and fear disguises itself as faith. When the sacred replaces the true, thinking is no longer a path to knowledge. It is a liability to be managed, and the mind adapts by learning which thoughts must never fully form. Because in a system where truth is holy, the greatest threat is not error but awareness. In Rome and Athens, law was celebrated as the triumph of reason over chaos, as the shield that separated civilization from barbarism. And on the surface, this was true. Laws did protect citizens from arbitrary violence, personal revenge, and constant instability. They created predictability, safety, and a shared framework that allowed large societies to function. But protection was only one side of the transformation, because the same laws that guarded people also defined their limits. Law did not merely stop harm, it shaped acceptable behavior, deciding who counted as a full person and who did not, who deserved rights and who existed only as property. The citizen was protected, the slave was regulated, the foreigner was managed, and the poor were disciplined. Legality created an illusion of equality while preserving deep hierarchies. And this is where the question becomes uncomfortable, because control wrapped in law feels different from control enforced by force. People obey, not because they fear immediate punishment, but because they believe the system is just. When obedience feels moral, resistance feels wrong. In Rome, law taught people that order was virtue and stability was sacred. In Greece, law trained citizens to see participation as duty, but participation itself was limited. Law protected those inside its definition and controlled those outside it. And over time, people learned to measure justice not by compassion or conscience, but by legality. Is this allowed? Is this forbidden? Is this permitted? And this shift quietly moved responsibility away from the individual and into the system. When something unjust happened, people could say it was legal and feel absolved. Law did not need to watch everyone because culture taught people to watch themselves. And that is the deeper power of ancient legal civilization. It reduced chaos but also narrowed moral imagination. It created safety but also normalized inequality. And it taught humanity a lesson that would echo for centuries, that a system can be orderly without being humane, and that laws can protect people while simultaneously teaching them how to obey without asking whether obedience itself is right. Citizenship in the ancient world was often described as freedom, but in reality it functioned more like a privilege granted to a limited group rather than a universal right to be a citizen. In places like Rome or Greece meant protection under the law, participation in political life, and recognition as a full human being within the system. But this status was not earned by virtue alone. It was inherited, restricted, and carefully guarded. Women, slaves, foreigners, and the poor lived under the same cities, yet outside the promise of citizenship. Their lives were regulated but not fully protected for them. The law did not represent freedom, it represented boundary citizenship. Therefore created a sharp divide between those who were free because they belonged and those who were controlled. Because they did not, freedom was not something one possessed naturally. It was something the system allowed you to experience under certain conditions. And this conditional freedom shaped culture deeply. People learned to equate belonging with liberty and exclusion with inferiority. The danger of this arrangement is subtle, because when freedom is experienced as a privilege, it becomes something to be defended rather than expanded. Citizens protect the system that grants them status, even when it oppresses others, because losing privilege feels like losing freedom itself. And so citizenship trained people to accept inequality as natural, to see hierarchy as order, and to mistake access for autonomy. This legacy persists today, whenever rights feel conditional, whenever belonging determines worth, and whenever people defend systems, not because they are just, but because they include them. The ancient question remains unresolved. Was citizenship ever meant to free the human being, or simply to organize society by rewarding obedience with inclusion? When justice became systematized, mercy did not disappear. It was displaced, pushed to the margins, treated as a weakness rather than a virtue. Systems are designed to be consistent, predictable, and impersonal because consistency creates order. But mercy is personal, situational, and human. It requires judgment, empathy, and the willingness to see the individual behind the rule. And this is precisely what systems try to eliminate. When justice becomes a mechanism, it no longer asks who is suffering or why, it asks only whether a rule was broken and how it must be applied. Mercy slows systems down. It introduces uncertainty and exceptions threaten structure. So mercy is gradually reframed not as humanity but as bias, not as compassion but as inconsistency. The system tells itself that fairness means treating everyone the same even when their situations are not the same. And in doing so, it absolves itself of moral responsibility. Once a punishment follows procedure, it feels justified even if it causes harm. The individual enforcing it can say, "The system decided, not me." And this is where mercy gets lost. Not because people become cruel, but because cruelty becomes distributed across rules, offices, protocols, and processes. No single person feels responsible for the outcome. Suffering becomes abstract paperwork, replaces faces, and justice becomes something that happens rather than something that is chosen. Mercy survives only in the gaps, where individuals dare to interrupt the process, to see a human being instead of a case. But those interruptions are risky because systems punish deviation, even when it is compassionate. Over time, cultures trained by systems learn to distrust mercy. They fear it will undermine order, weaken authority, or invite chaos. And so mercy is preserved as an ideal praised in stories and sermons, but rarely practiced in institutions. Justice becomes efficient but cold, lawful but distant, orderly but incomplete. And the unsettling truth is that a society can be perfectly just by its own rules while being profoundly unmerciful to the people living under them. The question is not whether systems need justice. They do. The question is whether justice without mercy can ever truly serve humanity, or whether it inevitably transforms order into a polished form of indifference. The system does not ask you to obey. It asks you to fit in, and this distinction changes everything. Obedience is visible, it can be resisted. It creates clear lines between authority and the individual. But conformity is quiet, it feels voluntary, even reasonable. The system no longer needs to command because it shapes the environment. so that only certain behaviors make sense. Adaptation replaces submission. People adjust not because they are forced, but because deviation carries social cost, exclusion, loss of opportunity. Silence, invisibility, fitting in becomes survival. Not through fear of punishment, but through fear of being left behind. Culture rewards those who align smoothly, who speak the right language, adopt the right values, move at the expected pace, and those rewards feel earned, which makes the system stronger, because people defend what they believe they achieved. On their own, conformity also shifts responsibility inward. When you fail, it feels personal, not structural. You blame yourself for not adapting well enough, rather than questioning the conditions that demanded adaptation in the first place. This internalization is powerful because it turns the individual into both subject and enforcer. The system does not need guards when people police themselves, adjusting behavior before anyone asks, suppressing difference before it becomes visible. And this is why conformity is more efficient than obedience. Obedience ends when authority disappears. Conformity continues even in its absence because it lives inside habit, expectation, and identity. The system's greatest achievement is not control, but alignment. When people move in the same direction without being told and mistake that movement for choice. And the quiet danger is that once fitting in becomes the measure of success, standing apart feels irresponsible rather than courageous, and freedom slowly transforms from the ability to choose differently into the skill of adapting quickly enough to avoid friction. If choice exists, but desire does not belong to you, then freedom becomes a performance rather than a condition, because choice alone is not enough to define autonomy. Autonomy begins where desire originates, when you are free to select between options that were prepared in advance, shaped by expectations, rewards, and invisible pressures. Your action feels voluntary, but its direction is already guided. You move, but along a path drawn by others. This is why modern control rarely restricts movement. It curates preference. It teaches people what to want long before they ever face a decision. And once desire is shaped, choice follows automatically. People defend their decisions passionately because they feel personal. Yet they rarely ask where those desires came from, who benefited from them, or why alternative desires feel unthinkable. Freedom becomes confused with activity, with movement, with consumption, with participation. And as long as you are choosing something, it feels like agency, but agency without ownership of desire is hollow. It keeps the body active while the will is guided. This creates a subtle dependency because when satisfaction fails, people blame themselves for choosing poorly rather than questioning the system that defined what was worth choosing in the first place. True freedom is uncomfortable because it requires uncertainty and responsibility. It asks not only what can I choose, but why do I want this at all? And this question is dangerous to systems built on predictability because it interrupts the flow of compliance when desire is borrowed. Freedom is reduced to navigation, selecting, efficiently adapting, quickly optimizing oneself to fit within acceptable outcomes. And the tragedy is not that people lack options, but that imagination narrows so thoroughly that unoffered desires fade from awareness. And when people can choose endlessly, yet cannot choose what to want, the appearance of freedom remains intact, while its substance quietly disappears, leaving behind lives that are busy, expressive, and restless, yet always moving toward goals that never quite feel like their own. Power grows stronger as it becomes invisible, because what can be seen can be questioned, and what can be questioned can be resisted. Visible power reveals its source, its limits, and its intentions, but invisible power dissolves into the environment. It stops feeling like force and starts feeling like reality itself. When power hides inside norms, routines, technologies, and expectations, it no longer needs to defend itself. People do not argue with it because they do not recognize it as power at all. They experience its effects as common sense, personal choice, or natural order. And this is its greatest advantage. Resistance requires an object, and invisible power offers none. It shapes behavior without issuing commands, directs movement without giving orders, and disciplines without punishment. People adapt willingly because deviation feels irrational, risky, or socially costly, and adaptation feels mature, responsible, and smart. Invisible power also relocates control. Inward individuals begin to regulate themselves, anticipating reactions, adjusting identity, filtering thought long before any external authority intervenes. This self-regulation is efficient because it removes conflict. The system does not need to silence dissent. It simply makes dissent feel unnecessary, awkward, or unproductive. The more invisible power becomes, the more total its influence, because it operates at the level of desire, attention, and identity, rather than at the level of action alone. And when power reaches this stage, it does not need loyalty or fear. It only needs normality. Because once something feels normal, it becomes unquestionable. And the final danger of invisible power is not oppression, but acceptance. People live inside it, defend it, reproduce it, and pass it on without ever naming it. And by the time its effects are felt, there is nothing left to confront except habits that feel like life itself. Humans are no longer governed, they are guided. And this shift marks one of the most profound changes in the history of control. Governance is visible. It relies on rules. Authority, punishment, and clear structures of command. Guidance is subtle. It works through suggestion, design, incentives, and invisible pathways that shape behavior without demanding obedience. When people are governed, they know who governs them, and that knowledge creates the possibility of resistance. When they are guided, control dissolves into the environment. Choices appear free, yet they are arranged. Outcomes feel personal, yet they are predicted. Culture no longer needs to force compliance. It builds systems in which the easiest, most rewarding path is also the most acceptable one, and humans naturally follow it. Not because they are weak, but because adaptation is efficient. Guidance operates ahead of awareness. It shapes attention before decision, desire before choice, identity before expression. People believe they are acting freely while moving along trajectories that were anticipated and optimized in advance. And because guidance does not feel like domination, it rarely triggers rebellion. Instead, it invites participation, alignment, and self-optimization. Individuals begin to adjust themselves constantly, refining behavior, language, and values to remain compatible with the system. This creates a form of control that is deeper than governance, because it recruits the self as an active participant. Humans no longer ask, "What is being demanded of me?" They ask, "How can I adapt better?" And this question locks them into continuous self-correction. Direction replaces command, and power no longer needs to stand above society. It flows through it quietly, shaping movement without ever revealing a hand. And the danger is not that people are manipulated, but that they lose the ability to tell the difference between being guided and being free. Because when direction feels like choice, control becomes almost impossible to see and even harder to escape. You are no longer told what to do. You are told what to want, and this is the most refined form of control civilization has produced, because action can be resisted, but desire feels personal. And once desire is shaped, compliance follows naturally, without force. In earlier systems, power relied on commands, laws, punishments, and prohibitions. People knew when they were being ordered, and that awareness left space for defiance. Even if it was dangerous, modern systems operate differently. They understand that the easiest way to guide behavior is not to restrict movement, but to design motivation. When people believe they are pursuing their own goals, they invest themselves fully defending those goals as expressions of identity. Culture today rarely uses the language of obligation. Instead, it uses aspiration, success, happiness, self-improvement, belonging, and fulfillment. These words do not constrain, they seduce, and through constant repetition, they begin to define what feels meaningful, long before any conscious decision is made. Individuals grow up surrounded by images of what a good life looks like, what success should resemble, what relationships should feel like, what bodies should be admired, and what futures should be desired. And because these images are everywhere, they stop feeling imposed. They feel obvious, natural, almost inevitable. People do not wake up choosing these desires. They inherit them quietly through media education, social comparison, and reward systems that praise alignment and visibility. When desire is guided, choice becomes predictable. People feel free because they are selecting among options. But the range of options itself has already been curated. This creates a loop in which dissatisfaction is continuously generated and immediately redirected toward new wants. Consumption becomes the primary form of movement, and fulfillment is always just out of reach, ensuring engagement never stops. The system does not need to threaten or punish it, only needs to promise and delay desire. Becomes a mechanism that keeps people busy, optimizing themselves, chasing approval, measuring worth, and fearing failure in games they did not design. When wanting replaces questioning, reflection becomes inefficient because it interrupts momentum, and momentum sustains the system. The most unsettling part is how deeply this control embeds itself into identity. People do not say, "I want this because I was taught to." They say, "I want this because it is who I am." And any challenge to that desire feels like a personal attack, rather than a structural critique. This makes resistance emotionally costly because it threatens self-image, belonging, and meaning. Individuals begin to police their own thoughts, adjusting ambitions before they fully form, abandoning desires that do not align with what is valued or rewarded. And this self-regulation is the system's greatest achievement because it removes the need for external enforcement. People discipline themselves in pursuit of goals that were never fully theirs, and blame themselves when fulfillment fails rather than questioning the framework that defined success in the first place. True freedom requires ownership of desire, the ability to sit with uncertainty, to imagine alternatives, and to tolerate not knowing what to want. But modern culture trains people to fear emptiness, to fill every pause with stimulation and every doubt with direction. And as long as desire is externally shaped, freedom remains incomplete. People move endlessly, choose constantly, express loudly, yet rarely pause long enough to ask the most dangerous question of all. Why do I want this, and who benefits from me wanting it? Because once that question is asked, the illusion begins to crack, and control loses its most powerful hiding place inside the human will itself. If freedom is absent, why do we still feel free? Is one of the most revealing questions of modern life. Because the feeling of freedom does not require freedom itself. It requires the sensation of choice, movement, and expression. And modern culture excels at producing these sensations while quietly limiting their depth. People feel free because they can move, speak, consume, travel, express opinions, and customize their lives. But these freedoms operate within invisible boundaries that are rarely questioned. The range of acceptable options is wide enough to feel expansive, but narrow enough to remain predictable. The mind interprets activity as autonomy and variety as independence, and as long as movement is possible, the absence of direction choice is mistaken for freedom, when in reality direction has already been shaped. The system does not imprison bodies, it occupies attention, desire, and identity. People feel free because no one is openly stopping them, yet they rarely ask who is guiding them, or why their choices align so neatly with cultural expectations. Feeling free is easier than being free, because being free requires responsibility, uncertainty, and the willingness to stand outside familiar patterns, which is uncomfortable and often isolating. Modern freedom replaces this discomfort with comfort, and comfort feels like liberation when pain is reduced. Anxiety quieted and convenience maximized. People interpret relief as freedom. Even when it is only the removal of friction, the system reinforces this illusion by rewarding participation, approval, and visibility. Those who align feel successful, validated, and included. And inclusion feels like liberty. Exclusion, on the other hand, feels like failure. Not because one is oppressed, but because one is disconnected. The greatest trick is psychological freedom is redefined as personal satisfaction rather than self-determination, as expression rather than authorship. People are encouraged to express themselves endlessly, while rarely being invited to question the structures shaping that expression. And because expression feels authentic, it shields the system from critique. People defend what they believe represents them and resist examining its origins. The result is a society that feels free because it is active, expressive, and constantly choosing, yet struggles to imagine alternatives beyond what is already offered. And this is why the sensation of freedom can exist, even when freedom itself is limited, because the system does not remove liberty. It simulates it, providing enough movement, enough choice, and enough voice to keep the feeling alive while ensuring that the direction of that movement remains aligned with interests that are rarely seen and even more rarely named. In earlier times, systems demanded obedience, and obedience was clear, visible, and enforced. You were told what to do, what not to do, and what would happen if you refused. Power stood above the individual, and control relied on commands, laws, punishments, and fear. People knew when they were being dominated, and that knowledge left space for resistance. Even if resistance was dangerous, disobedience had meaning, because authority was identifiable and pressure was external. But modern systems function differently. They rarely issue direct orders. Instead, they create environments in which only certain behaviors feel reasonable, acceptable, or rewarding. Adaptation replaces submission. The individual is no longer asked to obey, but to adjust, to fit, to optimize, to remain compatible with shifting expectations. Success now depends not on loyalty, but on flexibility. Those who adapt quickly are praised. Those who do not are left behind without visible punishment. Exclusion, invisibility, and irrelevance become the new consequences. And because these consequences are social rather than violent, they feel natural rather than imposed. People begin to measure themselves, constantly asking not, am I obeying, but am I keeping up? This internalizes control because the individual becomes responsible for alignment. Failure feels personal, not political. And frustration is directed inward rather than toward the system. Adaptation is efficient because it never ends. Expectations evolve, norms shift, platforms change, and people must continually reshape themselves to remain included. This creates permanent motion without resistance. The system does not need to defend itself because it appears neutral, dynamic, inevitable. And when adaptation becomes the highest virtue, stability no longer means security, it means falling behind. And in such a world, obedience would actually be easier, because it would end once the command is fulfilled. Adaptation has no finish line. It demands constant self-adjustment, and this endless requirement is the defining feature of modern control. People are not held in place. They are kept moving, always adjusting, always updating, always trying to fit, and mistaking this movement for freedom, even as the space to choose differently quietly narrows and disappears. In earlier times, systems demanded obedience, and obedience was clear, visible, and enforced. You were told what to do, what not to do, and what would happen if you refused. Power stood above the individual, and control relied on commands, laws, punishments, and fear. People knew when they were being dominated, and that knowledge left space for resistance. Even if resistance was dangerous, disobedience had meaning, because authority was identifiable and pressure was external. But modern systems function differently. They rarely issue direct orders. Instead, they create environments in which only certain behaviors feel reasonable, acceptable, or rewarding. Adaptation replaces submission. The individual is no longer asked to obey, but to adjust, to fit, to optimize, to remain compatible with shifting expectations. Success now depends not on loyalty, but on flexibility. Those who adapt quickly are praised. Those who do not are left behind without visible punishment. Exclusion, invisibility, and irrelevance become the new consequences. And because these consequences are social rather than violent, they feel natural rather than imposed. People begin to measure themselves, constantly asking not, "Am I obeying?" but "Am I keeping up?" This internalizes control because the individual becomes responsible for alignment. Failure feels personal, not political. And frustration is directed inward rather than toward the system. Adaptation is efficient because it never ends. Expectations evolve, norms shift, platforms change, and people must continually reshape themselves to remain included. This creates permanent motion without resistance. The system does not need to defend itself because it appears neutral, dynamic, inevitable. And when adaptation becomes the highest virtue, stability no longer means security, it means falling behind. And in such a world, obedience would actually be easier because it would end once the command is fulfilled. Adaptation has no finish line. It demands constant self-adjustment, and this endless requirement is the defining feature of modern control. People are not held in place. They are kept moving, always adjusting, always updating, always trying to fit, and mistaking this movement for freedom, even as the space to choose differently quietly narrows and disappears. Comfort replaced freedom, not suddenly and not by force, but by persuasion. Because comfort feels gentle and freedom feels demanding. Freedom requires risk, uncertainty, responsibility, and the courage to stand apart, while comfort promises safety, predictability, and relief from struggle. Modern culture learned that people will surrender freedom willingly if the exchange reduces anxiety and discomfort. And this exchange was framed as progress. Life became easier, faster, more convenient. Pain was minimized, effort was optimized, choices multiplied, and with each improvement, the question of freedom felt less urgent. Because when daily survival no longer hurts, people stop asking what they are giving up. Comfort does not imprison it, softens it, removes friction, and in doing so, it dulls the awareness that friction once revealed. Boundaries, when obstacles disappear, the limits become harder to see. People feel free because nothing is blocking them, yet the path itself has been quietly narrowed. Comfort trains the mind to avoid discomfort, and discomfort is where freedom lives. Because choosing freely often means choosing uncertainty, choosing slowness, choosing isolation, choosing paths that offer no immediate reward. A comfortable life discourages these choices by making them feel unnecessary, irrational, or extreme. People begin to associate freedom with ease rather than autonomy, and once that association is complete, freedom loses its sharp edges. It becomes the ability to relax, consume, enjoy, and remain undisturbed rather than the ability to decide one's direction independently. Systems reinforce this by rewarding comfort. Compliant behavior is smoother, more efficient, less costly. Dissent introduces tension, and tension feels unpleasant. So people avoid it, not because they are forbidden, but because they are conditioned. Comfort also shifts responsibility. When life is comfortable, problems feel personal rather than structural. Dissatisfaction is treated as a failure to optimize oneself, rather than a signal to question the environment. And this internalization protects the system because people turn inward instead of outward. Freedom becomes a lifestyle choice, rather than a political or existential condition, and lifestyle can be curated, managed, and sold. The most dangerous aspect of comfort is that it feels humane. It reduces suffering and offers relief, and because of this, it becomes morally difficult to criticize. Who would argue against ease, convenience, and safety? But history shows that freedom rarely grows in comfort. It grows in tension, discomfort, and conflict, and when comfort becomes the highest value, freedom is quietly reframed as inconvenience, something noble in theory but impractical in daily life. And so people settle not because they are defeated, but because they are soothed. They accept guidance because it removes effort. They accept limits because they reduce stress. And they defend the systems that provide comfort because losing them feels like losing freedom itself, even when what is being lost is only convenience. This is how comfort replaces freedom, not by removing choice, but by making the cost of choosing differently feel too high. And the tragedy is that once comfort becomes the measure of a good life, the desire for freedom begins to fade. Not because people are controlled, but because they are content enough not to ask what more might be possible. Obedience was once recognized as submission, something imposed from outside, something that carried moral weight and therefore could be judged resisted or condemned. When a person obeyed unjust power, it was seen as weakness, fear, or even guilt, because obedience implied surrendering one's will to another. And that surrender could be named the language of obedience, made control visible and visibility allowed. Moral evaluation, people could ask who commands, who obeys, and why. But as systems evolved, this clarity faded. Obedience did not disappear, it transformed into conformity. And conformity feels different because it appears voluntary. Adapting to expectations does not feel like submission. It feels like maturity. Realism and intelligence culture stopped praising loyalty to authority and started rewarding flexibility, compatibility, and alignment. Those who adjusted smoothly were seen as responsible adults, while those who resisted were labeled rigid, impractical, or disruptive. This shift changed the moral landscape profoundly. Obedience could be criticized, but conformity is normalized, because it hides inside social norms, habits, and expectations rather than explicit orders. People are no longer told what to do. They are shown how successful people live, speak, and think, and encouraged to imitate them. Alignment becomes aspirational rather than compulsory, and because it is framed as self-improvement, people defend it fiercely. Adaptation moves the burden of control inward. Individuals monitor themselves, constantly adjusting behavior, beliefs, and even emotions to fit what is acceptable, and rewarded failure no longer feels like oppression, it feels like personal inadequacy. This internalization makes conformity far more powerful than obedience, because it never ends. Obedience concludes when the order is fulfilled. Conformity demands continuous calibration. There is always a new norm to meet, a new standard to align with, and this creates a permanent state of self-correction that feels productive but erodes autonomy over time. The system no longer needs to justify itself because it appears neutral, dynamic, and inevitable, and people no longer feel morally conflicted about complying because they are not obeying anyone, they are simply fitting in. And this is the quiet tragedy. Obedience once carried the possibility of guilt, which carried the possibility of refusal. Conformity carries no guilt, only fear of exclusion, and fear of exclusion is enough to keep behavior aligned without ever naming it as control. The moment obedience became a sin and conformity became normal, society lost the language to describe submission, and without language, resistance becomes difficult, because people cannot oppose what they cannot name. And so adaptation spreads unnoticed, praised as common sense, while freedom slowly dissolves into the background of everyday life. We have moved through centuries believing that civilization was lifting us upward, that each transformation brought us closer to freedom, wisdom, and control over our own lives. Yet when we look carefully at the path from ritual to routine, from survival to law, from faith to reason, from function to comfort, a different picture emerges. Culture did not simply evolve around us. It reshaped us slowly, patiently, almost kindly, teaching us how to live inside systems without constantly feeling their weight. The most dangerous changes were never violent. They were gentle. They arrived as solutions to fear, chaos, pain, and uncertainty. And because they helped us survive, they were welcomed. And because they were welcomed, they were never fully questioned. Every era promised relief. The ancient world promised survival. The classical world promised order. The medieval world promised meaning. The Renaissance promised dignity. The industrial age promised stability. The modern world promised comfort and connection. And with each promise, something was gained, but something else was quietly surrendered. Not all at once, not consciously, but through adaptation we learned how to fit better, how to move smoothly, how to avoid friction, how to silence doubt before it became dangerous, how to trade depth for efficiency and freedom for ease. And none of this felt like loss, because loss is loud, while adaptation is quiet. Adaptation feels like growing up, like being realistic, like understanding how the world works. And this is why it is so effective. Obedience once required force. Conformity requires only expectation. Comfort once followed freedom. Now it replaces it. People no longer ask, who controls me? Because control no longer looks like domination. It looks like normal life. The system does not demand loyalty. It rewards alignment. It does not silence voices. It drowns them in noise. It does not forbid questions. It makes them exhausting to ask. And this leaves us in a strange position, more informed than any generation before us, yet less certain of what we truly want, more connected than ever, yet deeply isolated in our thinking, more expressive than ever yet, increasingly predictable. And the greatest illusion we live with is the belief that movement equals freedom, that choice equals autonomy, that comfort equals success. But freedom was never about how easily you move within a path. It was about whether you could choose a different one. Freedom was never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be conscious, and consciousness is heavy. It requires attention, responsibility, and the courage to sit with discomfort without immediately escaping into distraction, optimization, or approval. The question that remains at the end of this long journey is not whether civilization was wrong. It allowed us to survive, flourish, and build extraordinary things. The question is whether we remember that adaptation is not the same as freedom, and that a life that runs smoothly can still be deeply guided if culture is now invisible, if power is now quiet, if control now feels like choice. Then the task of freedom becomes harder, not because it is forbidden, but because it requires awareness. And awareness demands stillness in a world that never stops moving. Perhaps the most radical act today is not rebellion, but pause, not shouting, but noticing, not choosing faster, but asking where desire comes from and whether it is truly ours. Civilization changed us profoundly. It taught us how to endure, how to fit, how to optimize, how to survive systems we no longer see. And the final unresolved question is simple and uncomfortable. After all this adaptation, after all this progress, are we living deliberately, or are we simply very good at adjusting to whatever comes next? And if freedom is still possible, it will not arrive as comfort. It will arrive as awareness. The moment you realize that fitting in is not the same as choosing, and that silence is not peace when it is learned rather than chosen. This is not the end of the story. It is the point where the question finally returns to the individual. Not what does the system allow, but what am I willing to notice? And if this question stayed with you, if it made you uneasy, if it slowed you down even briefly, then the conversation is only beginning. If you've made it this far, don't rush away. Sit with what you've just heard for a moment, because this channel is not here to entertain you quickly or comfort you easily. It exists to slow you down, to disturb familiar thoughts, and to ask questions that most places avoid. Asking this is not content designed to tell you what to believe. It is space created for thinking in a world that constantly pushes you to react instead of reflect. If these ideas resonated with you, if even one sentence made you pause, feel uneasy, or see something familiar from a different angle, then this is exactly where you belong. Subscribing to this channel is not about notifications or algorithms. It is a quiet decision to keep questioning, to stay aware, to resist living entirely on autopilot. Every video here is part of a longer journey through history, philosophy, psychology, and power. Not to glorify the past or condemn the present, but to understand how we became who we are and how easily we mistake adaptation for freedom. When you subscribe, you're not joining a crowd. You're choosing to continue a conversation that doesn't end with answers, but deepens with every question. And if you found value here, share this video, not to convince others, but to invite them into the same pause. Because real change never spreads through force. It spreads through awareness. Leave a comment. Not to agree or disagree, but to think out loud. What part of this stayed with you? What made you uncomfortable? What question followed you after the video ended? This channel grows not through volume, but through depth. Through people who are willing to sit with complexity instead of escaping it. And if you want more videos that explore how culture shapes desire, how systems guide behavior, and how freedom quietly changes its meaning over time, then stay here, subscribe, turn on notifications if you want. But more importantly, return with curiosity, because the most important habit we can rebuild is not routine, but awareness. This channel isn't about telling you how to live, it's about helping you notice how you already are, and once you notice, you're no longer completely guided. Thank you for watching, thank you for thinking, and remember, freedom does not begin with rebellion, it begins with noticing. Before you go, take one last breath and don't let the noise rush back in immediately. Thank you for staying until the end, not just for watching, but for thinking, for giving your attention in a world that constantly tries to steal it. This video does not end here. It continues in the questions you carry with you. After the screen goes dark, if something unsettled you, if something felt uncomfortably familiar, then it has already done its work. You don't need to agree with everything said here. You only need to remain aware and curious as you return to your everyday routines. Remember that the most powerful systems are the ones we stop noticing, and the most meaningful freedom begins when we start noticing again. Take care of your attention. It is more valuable than you're taught to believe. And when you're ready, come back. There are many more conversations waiting here. Until next time, stay aware, stay curious, and thank you for being here. When humans handed thinking over to God, the first thing they felt was relief. Not because life became easier, but because uncertainty became bearable. The medieval world was shaped by constant insecurity. Disease, famine, war, and sudden death surrounded everyday life, and the human mind searched desperately for stability. Faith offered a framework that did not ask people to understand the world, only to trust it, and this trust removed a heavy burden. The burden of endless questioning, of moral doubt, of trying to make sense of suffering alone, when answers were believed to come from a divine source. The individual no longer carried full responsibility for meaning. Truth and judgment existence stopped feeling random and began to feel guided. And in that sense, surrendering thought did bring comfort. But this comfort was not neutral. It reshaped the inner life profoundly. Once truth was considered absolute, thinking itself became dangerous. Curiosity was no longer a virtue, but a temptation. Doubt was not a step toward understanding, but a sign of weakness or corruption. And so the mind learned to rest by avoiding conflict rather than resolving it. People were taught that peace came from acceptance, not exploration. And over time, this lesson became internalized. Faith did not only organize beliefs, it organized emotions, fear, guilt, hope, and desire. All became regulated by doctrine. The conscience was no longer a personal dialogue, but a reflection of sacred rules. And this removed the exhausting struggle of moral ambiguity, but it also reduced the capacity for independent judgment when actions are guided by divine command. Responsibility shifts upward. Individuals act not because they have decided, but because they have submitted. And this submission feels lighter because failure is no longer entirely personal. Sin can be confessed, doubt can be forgiven, obedience can be rewarded. The system absorbs anxiety and returns reassurance, but at the same time, it conditions the mind to associate safety with agreement and danger with thought. The human spirit adapts by learning when not to think, by silencing questions before they fully form. This creates a quiet psychological dependence, because once thinking is outsourced, the individual becomes less confident in their own judgment and more reliant on authority to define right and wrong. This reliance feels like humility, but it gradually weakens inner moral muscles that only grow through use. The relief of faith therefore resembles rest. More than healing, it quiets the pain without addressing its source. And while this rest can be necessary in times of extreme hardship, it becomes limiting when prolonged. Entire generations grew accustomed to living inside answers rather than seeking them. And when later eras attempted to awaken critical thought, they encountered resistance, not because people were incapable of thinking, but because thinking had long been associated with danger, anxiety, and punishment. The comfort of surrender had become familiar, and familiarity feels safer than freedom. The medieval exchange of thought for faith provided emotional stability, but delayed intellectual responsibility. It protected the mind from chaos, but also from growth, and this legacy continues to echo whenever people prefer certainty over understanding, obedience over inquiry, and comfort over the difficult work of forming their own convictions. Because once a culture learns that peace can be purchased by surrendering thought, it becomes very hard to convince it that freedom is worth the discomfort of thinking again. A thinking human was still not a free human, because thought alone does not guarantee autonomy. It only reveals the boundaries within which autonomy is allowed. During the Renaissance, people learned to question, observe, and imagine, but they also learned that ideas carry consequences. The mind could travel far while the body remained constrained. Thinkers discovered new truths, yet had to measure every word, every symbol, every conclusion against power, religion, and tradition. Thinking expanded, but expression was filtered. This created a paradox. A person could see the world differently, yet live within the same structures unchanged. Awareness grew faster than freedom, and this gap produced tension rather than liberation. Many thinkers lived double lives: outwardly compliant, inwardly radical, adapting, not by surrendering thought, but by hiding it. Culture rewarded intelligence that knew when to stop speaking, and punished honesty that moved too quickly. Thinking therefore became a private act, while obedience remained public. The individual gained an inner world, but did not gain control over the outer one. Freedom requires not only the ability to think, but the ability to act on thought without fear, and that condition was rare. The Renaissance proved that consciousness can awaken long before society allows it to move, and this delay taught generations a quiet lesson. Thinking is powerful, but survival still demands caution. So the thinking human learned restraint, learned compromise, learned to navigate limits rather than break them, and in doing so, adapted once again, becoming more aware, but not yet free, aware of possibility, but trained to live without it. As laws multiplied, something subtle happened to the human conscience. Responsibility slowly moved outward. When rules are few, people must rely on judgment. When rules are many, judgment feels unnecessary. The law begins to think for you, decide for you, excuse you. In the ancient world, this shift was profound because law promised fairness and order, but in doing so, it also offered relief. Relief from moral burden. People no longer had to ask what is right. They only had to ask what is permitted, and this distinction matters, because legality and morality are not the same. The law is designed to manage society, not to perfect the soul. As legal systems grew more complex, they covered more behavior, more situations, more possibilities. And with each addition, the space for personal conscience narrowed. Not because people became evil, but because they became comfortable. When an action is legal, it feels justified even when it harms. When an action is illegal, it feels wrong even when it is compassionate. The law creates moral shortcuts. It teaches people to outsource ethical thinking to structure. And once this outsourcing becomes habitual, conscience weakens not dramatically but quietly. People stop feeling responsible for outcomes and start feeling responsible only for compliance. History shows this clearly. Atrocities can be committed within legal frameworks. Discrimination can be normalized by statutes. Violence can be bureaucratized and still feel clean because it follows procedure. The danger is not that law exists. Society needs it. The danger is when law replaces inner judgment instead of supporting it. When people say, "I followed the law," instead of "I did what was right," this is not the collapse of conscience, but its sedation. Conscience does not disappear, it becomes dormant, waiting for moments when law fails and reality forces the individual to choose again. The uncomfortable truth is that strong legal systems require strong consciences to remain humane, but cultures often build the former while neglecting the latter. And when law grows faster than moral reflection, people become orderly, but not necessarily just obedient, but not necessarily good. And this may be the paradox at the heart of civilization. The more rules we create to control behavior, the less we practice the inner discipline required to choose wisely without them. During the industrial age, the transformation of the human being reached a new stage, one that did not rely on belief or law alone, but on efficiency culture. No longer asked who you were or what you believed. It asked what you could do and how consistently you could do it. Time was broken into units, days into shifts, life into schedules, and the human body was reorganized to match the rhythm of machines. Work no longer followed the natural cycles of light seasons, or need it followed the clock and the factory whistle. And this mechanical order reshaped the human mind as deeply as it reshaped cities. People adapted by learning to suppress instinct, fatigue, emotion, and reflection in favor of productivity. Repetition became the dominant experience. Not ritual repetition filled with meaning, but mechanical repetition emptied of it. The value of a person was measured by output, reliability, and speed. Identity slowly detached from inner life and attached itself to function. What you did became who you were, and culture reinforced this relentlessly. Discipline, punctuality, obedience, and endurance were praised as virtues, while slowness, deviation, and idleness were framed as moral failures. Freedom was redefined again, not as control over one's life, but as the ability to survive within the system. Through wages, comfort, and predictability, people were told they were free because they could work, choose employment, consume goods. But this freedom was conditional and narrow. The structure of life itself was no longer negotiable. The industrial system did not need belief or loyalty. It needed consistency, and humans adapted perfectly. Learning to become interchangeable, replaceable, efficient inner depth was unnecessary. Silence was productive, and questioning slowed the machine. So it was discouraged. Adaptation reached a point where people began to see themselves as parts of a larger mechanism, responsible not for meaning but for performance. Conscience weakened further because responsibility was fragmented. No one felt fully accountable for outcomes, only for tasks. Assigned suffering became abstract, distant, spread across systems, and justified by necessity. The greatest achievement of the industrial age was not technological, It was psychological. Humans learned to live as functions. Without constantly feeling the loss, they learned to find pride in productivity, identity in occupation, worth in endurance. And this training left a lasting imprint. Even beyond factories, modern life still rewards efficiency over reflection, speed over depth, and compliance over autonomy. The industrial age taught culture that control does not require force or faith. It only requires structure, and humans trained within structure will adapt until function feels natural and meaning becomes optional. In the ancient classical world, culture took a decisive turn. Survival was no longer managed only by instinct, tradition, or ritual. It was organized through law, and this transformation changed the relationship between the human being and power. Forever, law was presented not as domination but as civilization. Not as force but as fairness. Rules were written, codified, displayed in public spaces, and taught as the foundation of order for the first time. Obedience no longer came only from fear of nature or the gods, but from trust in systems. People were told that laws existed to protect them, to create stability, to ensure justice, and this belief made control far more effective because it felt legitimate. The Greek polis and the Roman Republic framed law as a shared agreement, a rational structure that elevated humans above chaos. But beneath this promise lay a quiet shift. Culture was no longer something inherited unconsciously. It became something enforced consciously. Behavior was no longer guided by collective instinct, but by abstract rules that applied equally in theory but unevenly in practice. Citizens learned that freedom existed within boundaries drawn by law. You were free as long as you remained inside the framework, and those boundaries quickly became invisible because they were normalized. Law did not feel like restriction, it felt like order, and order feels safe, especially when contrasted with disorder. Punishment was no longer immediate or personal. It was procedural, distant, institutional. This distance softened resistance. People did not feel oppressed, they felt governed, and governance was celebrated as progress over barbarism. But this progress carried a cost. Moral responsibility began to shift from the individual to the system. People no longer asked, "Is this right?" They asked, "Is this legal?" And culture slowly absorbed this logic. Justice was no longer an internal compass. It became an external reference. The law decided what was acceptable, what was punishable, and what was ignored. And once behavior aligned with legality, conscience became secondary. Adaptation changed again. It was no longer about survival or faith, but about compliance. Knowing the rules, navigating them, using them when possible, avoiding them when necessary. Law rewarded those who mastered its language, not those who questioned its purpose, and culture praised this mastery as intelligence, wisdom. Citizenship rebellion was no longer framed as danger to survival, but as danger to order. And order became sacred even when it preserved inequality. Slavery could exist within a legal system and still be called civilization. Conquest could be justified through law and still be called peace because legality masked violence with procedure. The most powerful outcome of this era was psychological. People learned to internalize law. They began to regulate themselves even when no authority was present, because culture taught them that law was morality and morality was stability. This is when obedience became respectable, when submission wore the mask of responsibility, and when culture stopped asking people to survive and started asking them to behave. And although later eras would change the language of control, the legal mind shaped here would remain a foundation, teaching generations that freedom was not the absence of constraint, but the privilege of operating correctly within it.